everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I am here with a really fun dyeing experiment. Does green apple Kool-Aid break? Before I talk about why I'm curious about this and how we will determine it, what is color breaking? Color breaking is when you have a dye mixture of a couple different molecules and you notice when you dye yarn that the colors separate. So say you have a purple mixture and it separates, it breaks into blue and pink. Or a green maybe breaks into some yellowish greens and more bluish greens. So this separation of colors that you get from one mixture is what we call breaking. Color breaking occurs because you have these different molecules and they bind to the yarn at different rates. Whether it is temperature or pH, there's different rates that they bind, and so if one is binding faster than another, you can see them separate and break. Think yarn chromatography. Of the 5 most commonly used artificial food coloring molecules in the US, the fastest to strike to yarn is red number 3. In my tap water, it strikes without me adding any additional acid. And the slowest is blue number 1. And so this is why with purples, you can see this extremely dramatically. Now, in the past, I have tried to break grape Kool-Aid with dip dyeing. And while it does technically break from the mixture of red 40, which strikes quickly but not as fast as red 3, and blue 1, the reason why it wasn't as dramatic is that each packet of Kool-Aid has citric acid as the first ingredient. So as we add more packets of Kool-Aid to our pot, we are increasing the acidity. And therefore, if there's more acid, things can strike faster, which can make it more difficult to separate the different colored molecules. Now, green apple contains yellow 5 and blue 1. And this could break. In the past, when I've seen greens break, it has either been for one of 2 reasons. Either there is some red in that mixture, and since those reds will always bind first, we can see breaking that way and get maybe a more brownish tip and a green finish. The other way I've seen breaking with a green is, say, in teal. Technically, yellows bind faster than blues, although they're both a lot slower than reds. And so if there's a lot more blue that's going to take a lot longer to bind, you might get some more of those yellows to bind first. And so you can see sort of a teal to a blue breaking. It is very subtle, but still definitely present. So is the green apple Kool-Aid going to break? Maybe. Probably not. But there's a chance, and the chance that we have is from when I was speckling with this recently, I saw what I'm pretty sure is this Kool-Aid breaking into green, yellow, and blue. Now, it's hard to say for sure because I was also using blue raspberry lemonade, but there's a chance, and so why not test it out to see if it would break? Today we will dye 100 grams of Knit Picks Wool of the Andes worsted weight yarn. This yarn is 100% Peruvian Highland wool, and it is not superwash. This is important because if we want to give a chance for these colors to break and separate as we're dip dyeing the yarn, we want to slow down absorption overall so we can try to maximize the difference between the yellows and the blues. And if I'm using a superwash yarn, we might not really be able to see that difference, at least with dip dyeing. Now, not everything that breaks, if you speckle or kettle dye, will break with dip dyeing, but we're gonna give this a shot and it should be really fun. A couple more things before we go jump into the project. To dye yarn with food coloring, you need your artificial food coloring. So in the US, that's red 3, red 40, yellow 5, yellow 6, blue 1, and sometimes you find blue 2. You need to have acid. Today our acid is going to come from the citric acid in those Kool-Aid packets, but I often also use white vinegar really frequently. You need to pick the right yarn. Unfortunately, you cannot dye cotton yarn with Kool-Aid or food coloring. You want a protein-based fiber like wool or other animal fibers for this to work. Finally, you need heat. And so we will be doing this dip dyeing in a kettle on my stovetop. I am personally comfortable dyeing yarn with food coloring in my standard cooking pots and pans. Today I'm gonna happen to be using my dedicated dye equipment because that's what I have out and what I've been using. Because if I'm gonna use any of my dedicated dye tools, then I'm gonna use all of my dedicated dye equipment. I don't mix my dyeing tools with my cooking tools. So I did want to point that out just in case you notice that I'm using the same things I use for acid dyes. But now, finally, let's get into the project. I am pre-soaking our yarn in just some plain tap water for 20 to 30 minutes. It doesn't need to be perfectly saturated, but I do want it fairly wet so we can absorb this color easily. In my dye pot, I have 16 cups of water, and we're gonna add 2 packets of green apple Kool-Aid. And actually, on the surface, do you see those blue? See those blue speckles? That is what I had seen before. Within the green, there were these like pops of blue. I'm not sure if like flavor profile wise, that's something specific, but again, just because we see it with speckling with the powder, because maybe there's a difference in how the pigments are mixed into the Kool-Aid packets, it doesn't mean that that's what we'll see when we dip dye. For techniques like this, it is probably a lot cheaper to get liquid food coloring drops than it is to get Kool-Aid packets. And so if you can't find Kool-Aid but want to have food coloring based powders, I do have some videos on how to make your own DIY sprinkles with sugar or citric acid powder to get some effects similar to what you can do with Kool-Aid powder. But anyway, now we are going to let this heat up completely. And so we'll get it to a boil, then we'll reduce the heat and dip dye and see what we can see. My gut says that we will get some kind of green gradient. I don't think I'll necessarily see breaking, but I also don't know if I've attempted to capture breaking with this color, so we will give it a shot. But usually when it comes to greens or colors breaking, oftentimes there's either a blue or green finish, so we will see. Rolling boil, we don't need that. I'm going to reduce the heat to low. I am going to gently remove the liquid from our pre-soak so we can come over and start dip dyeing. Now you can see that the pot is still very hot, but we're no longer bubbling. And in general, when it comes to felting concerns, going from cold to warm isn't really a problem. Going from hot to cold can cause more issues. So what we're doing is, as we're dipping, and I don't want to go too quickly because if we run out of yarn then we can't capture it, but the goal is to slowly dip into the Kool-Aid. And you can see we're starting to clear. The water does look like it's a little bit bluer. The water does look like it's getting bluer, but you can also see how pastel it's getting on the yarn. So there's barely any color left in there. It does look to me like what left has a hint of blue in it, but would I call this breaking? Not really. I mean, I do think that these ends are more mint, that there is less yellow, but I'm going to put the whole thing in now. That went really quickly. Looks like that there's maybe a piece of yarn that did not get dipped with the rest. So basically all the color has absorbed. And yeah, I don't see much breaking because it's hard to say if the differences are just a different saturation or if we're actually seeing hue shifts between green and blue. Maybe you could argue there's a little bit more blue in there, but It's a little too close. I doubt I will be trying this again specifically to investigate color breaking, but if I were gonna try it again, one of the things I might do is increase the volume of water, so that way that could slow down the absorption even more. And also with more water, I could have more packets of Kool-Aid, so there could be more pigment in there overall. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the problem with Kool-Aid is that the more dye you add, the more acid you add. And so you sort of want to also scale up your volume of water, so that way you can try to keep the pH consistent. Those are Kool-Aid considerations. If this were a green mixture, say McCormick's neon green, that we wanted to see if that broke, it would be easy to start with more dye and dip really slowly to see if we could see that using the same pH. But with Kool-Aid, the amount of pigmentation and then the amount of acid that you're adding are very related. Nevertheless, we got some really beautiful yarn. So right now I am going to let this heat for about 5 more minutes. Then I'm going to turn off the heat, let things cool down completely so we can wash it. Because as I mentioned, the bigger risk for felting is when you go from really hot to really cold versus going from a room temperature pre-soak to a hot dye bath. Why do we care about color breaking anyway? Mainly because it's really fun. Go and check out my Breaking Wilton's Violet playlist to see a lot of ways that I take the fact that this purple breaks so easily and I try to take advantage of that to create a lot of different fun colorways. Another reason why it could be worth knowing whether or not something breaks is so then you can try to avoid it. And in general, if you want to try to get more even color coverage, you want to start with low, preferably no acid, cool bath, huge volume of water, and lots of stirring. And that should help all of the pigments bind more evenly all over your yarn or fabric or whatever it is you are dyeing. But I think that color breaking is beautiful, and so I like to try to take advantage of it when I can. And once again, I do have to say that colors can break in different ways. You can see something break in speckling, like it looked like when we added the Kool-Aid to the pot here and we saw green and blue pigments sort of on that surface. So we know that that would happen now. It's possible that you might see breaking if you're doing something more immersion dyeing and you pour the dye on. Some colors may spread more than others, or sometimes you can capture it with dip dyeing. It really does depend on the rates that the dyes absorb to your yarn, and that can all be dependent on the fiber content itself. Things usually strike superwash faster than non-superwash, and alpaca and silk blends are even slower than wool. The heat, usually things strike faster the warmer it is, and also acid. Usually with a lot of colors, the lower the pH, so the more acidic it is, the faster colors will strike. These are all generalizations, but they're variables that are fun to play with when you're dyeing yarn. Now it is time to wash our Kool-Aid yarn. I just want to show you that the dye bath is completely clear. And well, we'll look at the final color in the end. But we will wash this with a little bit of just some random dish soap. There isn't any sugar in these Kool-Aid packets, but there is flavor and other stuff we want to rinse out. So I might do a couple more rinses than I would do with other yarns, but we should not see any color bleeding. If you see color bleeding, or if not all the color has absorbed to your yarn, you can add a splash of vinegar to the pot, or maybe you might need to heat and reset. But anyway, I am going to rinse this a few more times. Then I'm going to put the yarn through my spin dryer to remove some liquid. If you don't have a spin dryer, you can use a salad spinner. And then I'll hang up the yarn to dry and come back for some conclusions. Does green apple Kool-Aid break? I don't really think so. I mean, it absolutely breaks with speckling. In the speckles, we see some more green pigments and a couple blue pigments. There's breaking in there. But just because you can see colors break when you are speckling the dry powder onto yarn, that doesn't necessarily mean you will see breaking on the skein itself like we would have if we, say, used Wilton's Violet and had a really dramatic shift from purple to blue on the yarn. I did have one tiny mistake in this dyeing project. There's this section of yarn that I think got stuck outside the pot. So it isn't a perfect sort of repeating ombre type colorway because of this, but I think that the yarn is still really, really fun. Now, just because the colors didn't definitively or dramatically break doesn't mean that it's not a lot of fun. And there is always a chance that if we had a lot more pigment present, that we might be able to see that color breaking. But also, since it appears, and just based on the yellow-green color that it is, that there's so much more yellow than blue in the mixture, it would be really hard to get most of those yellows to bind so we can capture the blues at the end. I have a whole playlist that includes a bunch of my Kool-Aid dyeing videos. This powdered drink mix is actually so versatile, and there's so many different techniques that you can do with it. That being said, are there any techniques that you think I have not tried yet with Kool-Aid powder that you would like to see me try? Please let me know down in the comments below. I always keep track of all of your comments and suggestions and draw from that as I create new videos. While you're at it, please make sure you're subscribed to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. I release at least 2 new yarn dyeing videos every single week. Summer, winter, spring, and fall, and you really don't want to miss any of it. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.